Okay, well, we are live on Facebook with Reverend Dr. Alfie Wines.
Hello, Reverend Dr. Irie Lynn Session.
How are you doing?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Excited to have this time to chat with you today on Equity Live.
Oh, thank you. And I am excited. I have been looking forward to it ever since we talked about it. So I'm glad to be here.
Great. So why don't we begin by you talking a little bit about your being a board member for Equity for Women in the Church. So of course you and I have a history way before Equity for Women in the Church. We're both board members. But why was being on the board of Equity for Women in the Church something important for you to do, Dr. Wines?
Absolutely. I love being part of this group. And I also thank our colleague, Reverend Dr. Cynthia Cole, who connected me. And anyway, I'm glad to be part of it because it's through our connection. I am part of this group because I thoroughly believe in the importance of the need for making some serious changes. So
it looks like there's some kind of delay.
Okay. I think there is. When I believe that's right, that there is a delay, a few second delay between the actual time of the speaking and when it's when the recording goes through. But I think that's normal. When what I have read, that is the normal way that it is done.
Yeah, no, what I mean is when I'm looking at you, it freezes. That's what I meant to say, not delay. I know there's a delay. I meant it freezes, but I hear you now. So go ahead and talk about why it was important for you to be a part of Equity for Women in the Church.
All right. So in part because of my own experiences, but not just because of my experiences, also because of the experiences of so many clergy women that I have talked with who experience challenges, who experience some significant pain, we might say, because there is little, I won't say no, I almost said no, but let me say little equity for women in the church. Whether it is, simply the idea of a woman being the leader, being the one in the pulpit, and other roles, not just that, because what I have learned is that lay women experience the same issues that clergy women experience. So it's really a major issue. And in a day and time when it is so important for us to really broaden our thinking, to really be inclusive, to be diverse, equity, and all of these issues are so much in the forefront now. And it's a recognition that we really have some real serious problems that have been going on for a long, long time. I mean, centuries, okay?
Yeah.
And, each generation has to deal with that. But I think we live in a day and time when we have a great opportunity, not only because of some things that have gone on historically, but we've got the technology and, there's just no excuse. I mean, we really have no excuse for being closed-minded, for not recognizing, just a simple reality. We're all in the world together. And so it's important for us to utilize everybody's gifts, not put some to the side and say, well, no, that's not important, but to really recognize the whole community is better off when we honor and recognize the humanity of every person, the gifts of every person. And in this case, with the emphasis on women, and of course, as an African-American woman, as a Black woman, you know, not only the racism, not only the sexism and the misogyny and the discrimination against women is important, but also the issue regarding racism is important. And so I'm glad that equity actually has an emphasis on both of those areas that are important to me.
Right. Now, there is, I gave you a list of questions, right? And as you were talking, I thought of this one that is not on your list. So I hope you don't mind.
Okay.
So we're talking about equity. Equity is not the same as equality. Can you talk about the difference between equity, because we are concerned about both of those, right? Of course.
Yes.
But there is a difference between the two. What do you see as a difference between having equality and then having equity?
Oh, wow. Well, I would say this. I think that perhaps equity goes even deeper than equality does. And what I mean by that is, for example, when we're talking about, let's just talk money for a moment.
Yeah, let's talk money.
You know, so often, for example, perhaps less so, but I think it's still very prevalent. When the salary is set, if a man is in the position and it so happens that a man has a family, well, a church, unfortunately, is likely to pay that man, because he has a family, a whole lot more money. Well, then they get a woman in the position who might be single, and so they want to pay her a whole lot less than they would have paid that man. So there are some deep practical issues related to equity, whereas I think when people think of equality, it's more the idea of honoring the humanity of the person, recognizing that, you know, men and women ought to be treated equally and all of that. But equity is really much more of a practical approach to it, whereas perhaps equality may be more of a abstract or maybe ideological approach to the issue. And so
so the equity then, from what I hear you saying, from your understanding or the way you articulated, equity is more the praxis of the equality, right? It's more of, so how do we live that out? How do we live? Yes, so men and women in many churches and denominations both can preach, right? Both can be ordained in some. There's still a boatload of institutions and churches where women cannot be ordained. So there's not even the equality piece. But so the equality would say, all right, both of you can be ordained, but the equity comes in the praxis of that, in that, how are they paid now? Is there equality in the salaries, which really is about the equity piece?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So in your own ministry, Dr. Wines, has inequity, how has it, if it has, shown up for you in your life and ministry?
Oh, wow.
You don't have to give us all, but you know, just a couple, you know, share, let's be authentic and transparent as you are able to be, right? So how has inequity shown up for you in your life and ministry?
All right. I would say this, and that is that, first of all, let me just make an overall statement, and that is that I have certainly experienced racism and sexism in my journey as a minister, as a pastor. So let me just put that out there and say that that's a part of it. you know, one way that I might approach this question, since I'm a biblical scholar, is that in my teaching, I tend to talk a lot about women. I talk a lot about the fact that, you know, Israel is on the trade route between Africa and Asia, and of course we've got, you know, Africans and Asians. I mean, that's where we're coming from. That's the part of the world we're from. And very often in my teaching, you know, that can be a surprise to people. I guess I'll put it that way. And but when you really think about it, it's obvious. And a lot of times people are not receptive to that. And so that affects me as a woman, and that affects me as a biblical scholar, that affects me as a pastor, and that when I'm teaching and preaching what are some basics, really basics, it's unfortunate that that's a big deal. But at any rate, that is one way that I have sometimes been discriminated against because of how I approach this particular piece of being in ministry, of how I approach teaching and preaching and understanding of the Bible. And so, yeah, that it has certainly affected me on a very personal level.
So what does that look like? So you're saying that, so in your biblical scholarship, because you, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, you talk about the connection between Africa and Asia, right? So the Black presence in the Bible.
Yes.
And so help me to help us to see how teaching and preaching from that perspective has led to you experience inequity, your experience of inequity.
Well, people don't want to hear it. I mean, that's what I'm saying. People don't often accept that. And in doing that, give me a hard time about it. Maybe I can put it that way, by not accepting that. And of course, it makes a difference in terms of you know, where I'm working, because I have worked in multicultural churches. I have worked in, you know, Black churches. I have worked in white churches. I've worked in a wide variety of cultural settings. And I teach the same thing, regardless of what setting I'm in. But I can tell you that the reaction that I get is different depending on the setting that I'm in. And so, you know, when it's new to people and they haven't been taught that, and when it's a shock to them, they are very often, they're not receptive. And I'm talking about basically white congregations now. And that.
So here you're talking about racial inequity. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
But also the women is it's the same dynamic. Let me put it that way. It's the same dynamic. For example, the other day, I was talking even with a woman in the process of becoming a minister.
Mm-hmm.
When I explained to her that just because women are not noted in the text doesn't mean that they're not part of the story.
Okay.
And so, you know, that's like, what? And I'm going, well, yeah, think about it. And so, you know, I have felt that in a couple of ways. So yeah, it makes a big difference. It's for sure, it makes a big difference.
Okay. So given that, and given all of the myriad ways that women experience inequity in the church, what are you doing on a personal level to address inequity in the church?
All right. Well, let me talk about just some things outside of my work, and then I'll talk about how that affects my work. And outside of my work, when I work with young women, when I work with women who are thinking about, you know, going into ministry, or who are studying and preparing to be in ministry, I try to do two things. One is encourage them, but the other thing that I try to do is give them a realistic picture of how it is that working in church is very different than working in other organizations.
Mm-hmm.
There is and I have really spent a lot of time trying to wrap my mind around this, and that is, there are at least two things I can think of as to why the dynamic in church is different. For one, church members are not held accountable for anything. It's only the staff that are held accountable for things. And so that means that church members get away with doing whatever they want to do. And anyway, the pastors are affected by that, right? And held accountable when it's not something that they are really responsible for, is something that someone else did, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that's different is that you are relating to a community, whereas in a regular workplace, for one, everybody is accountable to somebody for something.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you're not relating to an entire group of people. You're related to your customers or your co-workers, but not just an entire community. And one of my students just pointed that out to me actually this week. And so it's a very, very different dynamic. And so I try to help women understand that it is a different dynamic, and it is a dynamic where you really need your network, and you really need to take care of yourself. Those are not just a luxuries. I was telling somebody the other day, when I was in school and they talked about self-care, I thought, oh, well, good, they want you to exercise, they want to make sure you exercise. Well, let me be clear. Many years later, I understand that means a whole lot more than go exercise. It's about taking care of your whole self, because you're really giving of your whole self in a way that you don't give of your whole self in other types of work settings. So that's the difference. So that's what I try to do, is make young women, encourage them, and at the same time make them aware. On a professional level, among the things that I've done, let me talk a little bit about my work with equity, because my work with equity began as a blog, and then it was an event that we held over in Dallas. You were one of my panelists, and that was at Metropolitan AME Church, right, where Reverend Dr. Cynthia Cole was pastoring at the time. And so we had that event over there, and one of my beloved professors came over, was part of that. You and then several other clergywomen, some clergy spouses. We had a daughter who spoke, talking about really the fact that it's not, ministry affects not just the woman, the clergy woman, but it affects those around her. And that's important to really understand, that the family is affected, that the friends are affected. And of course, clergy women feel the same thing. So that has become, so we started out with blog, then we went to.
So give more detail about what was the blog, or what was the event about, for people who are listening to this and don't know.
Oh my goodness. I wrote a blog on, I wish someone had told me. And what I was writing about was 10 things that I wish someone had told me about being a clergy woman, about being a woman in ministry. And so I can share my list if you want me to. But anyway, there were 10 things that I was really wishing someone had, just sat me down and said, okay, Alfie, let me help you.
Mm-hmm.
Tell you this is what you're going to have to deal with, and you need to prepare to deal with it. But of course, eventually, after a while, you get that. But I'm saying I would have loved to have known all of that going in, so I would be better prepared for it. Let me put it that way. All right. So after the blog, and then we had the event, And the event over in Dallas had about 10 panelists who talked about ministry. And the title of the event was emphasizing not only the clergy women, but those who love the clergy women. And that's why we had spouses and a daughter on the panel. And so, lo and behold, the question then became, well, what's the next step? What do we do? And so I'm pleased to share with the audience that I am editing now a book. I wish someone had told me, Equity for Women in the Church. And what the book does is we hear stories of the challenges and the blessings that clergy women face. Again, we are hearing from some family members, and we're talking about the fact that, you know, this has been an issue forever. It's not anything new.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the entries are historical. Some talk about the challenges. Some talk about the struggle going on today. Some talk about the future, and some ideas and some just suggestions as to what we can do to, you know, really make this a thing of the past, because it should not be. It just should not be. You know, it's interesting to me that the church is really a place where we are gathered to live out the ideals, to live out the best of what humanity is and the best of what humanity can be. That's what church is for.
Yeah.
You know, beyond any other organization that you might, you know, that we might find ourselves a part of, more than any of those, that is what church is all about. And then the sad thing is that that's the ideal, and yet the reality is that the reality is, I would say, nowhere near close to what the ideal is. I would have expected it would be closer to the ideal. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's even further away from the ideal.
Yeah, because the truth is, in some institutions and organizations, there exists more equity for women than the church offers.
Yes, absolutely.
There is accountability. I think you were saying that earlier when you were talking about, I can't remember what you were saying, but yeah, because there is accountability in many of these systems, in many of these organizations.
Yes.
You just can't do, oh, you were talking about how church members, in many cases, there is no accountability. They can say whatever they want, and there is no structural, judicatory accountability for church folk.
Yes.
Right? Right. Only the ordained, licensed clergy person. Right. Whereas in a organization per se, you know, there is some accountability. There are laws that govern, you know, discrimination, and even though it does happen still, but there is more that there are more resources that a woman would have at her disposal than they might have in a church setting.
Yes, you know, I'll tell you this little story as an example of what I'm talking about, and that is in one of my churches. I was told, well, you know, we really wanted a man.
See, just saying that could be a problem if you work for an organization outside of the church. Yeah.
You know, we really wanted a man, or we wanted a family man with some children. And I mean, you know, you know, here I am. I've been divorced for 30 years, and you know, I am a family woman. I have one beautiful daughter that I love with all my heart, but you know, I just didn't fit their image. And,
right.
So, you know, in HR, if we had an HR, when that happened, I would have gone to HR and made a complaint, right?
Exactly.
And what happened when the conversation happened around that, the church was was defended. Let me put it that way.
Of course.
Defended. And they said, oh, no, they didn't, I'm sure they didn't mean that, something along those lines. So,
I'm sorry for this noise. They're doing the yard out there, those blowers, so I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. So anyway, so those kinds of things are what I'm talking about when I talk about how the dynamic of working in church is very different than working in, other kinds of settings, whether profit or nonprofit. Of course you have your client base, but I'm talking about the employees. Everybody is accountable. And,
yeah. Now, as someone who has worked in nonprofit, I can attest. I worked in nonprofit for 22 years, and that split that between two nonprofits. There are still ways, of getting around doing the right thing in people's lives. You know what I'm saying? There are still ways of being unjust and not being equitable. In fact, there is a move now in our society for nonprofits to become more racially and monetarily equitable. There are many nonprofits that are engaging the expertise of and even hiring diversity and inclusion officers to make sure that the organization is not just offering equality, but equity.
yeah,
They're doing audits, like salary audits,
yeah,
to make sure that there is equity in the salary ranges. So even there's still work to be done
yeah,
on all fronts. But as you said earlier, Dr. Wines, it would seem to me that the church ought not have these kinds of issues, but we do.
yeah,
But we do.
but we do.
Yeah.
And hence the work and the hope and the expectation and the work. And in my case, one of the things that keeps me encouraged in the midst of all of this is Jesus promised that the church would prevail, that nothing would, stuff would happen, but the church would always remain the church. And so, despite all of that, I sometimes describe my relationship with the church as a love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is I am 100%, maybe 200%, however you want to describe it. I am a believer, and I also recognize the importance of community and the importance of fellowship, and how it is that helps us in our walk. It helps us to live out our walk, and I understand that. And at the same time, I just wish the church were better. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I wish the church lived up to its ideals more than it does. And I recognize it's human, never going to be perfect. I get that. But we surely can do a whole lot better than what we do.
Well, and that was my reason for asking you the question about what you're doing on a personal level to address inequity in the church. Because, it's like that I am because we are, right? We are because I am. That whole notion of we are the church. Each of us individually make up the collective church. And so we each have a part to play in the church becoming the beloved community, right? That Jesus and God would have us to be. And so we all have a part to play in that. And from what you explained about the book that you are writing about, I wish someone would have told me, right? So what you're offering, it sounds like, is what you said you had need of. You wish someone had told you some things as a woman in ministry that could have helped you navigate these systems of inequity and oppression and marginalization. And so it sounds like one of the things that you're doing on a personal level to address the inequity is to put out this book of other stories of women to help younger women or women coming into the ministry, so they can sort of have a guide of what to expect and better prepare themselves to address these systems. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Yes, I would.
Mm-hmm.
And I do some work with my theological reflection group, and I do some of the same kind of thing with them.
Well, people may not know what your theological reflection group is. Can you share a little bit about what that is?
Sure. I went to Bright Divinity School on the campus of Texas Christian University.
Okay.
And I am pleased that they have invited me to come back to campus and lead a theological reflection group. This is my second year doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And what it represents is a year of when a student is expected to work in a church or perhaps a camp setting or a nonprofit church-related setting, but they work for a year, for this whole school year, from August to May. And then we meet once a week and we talk about what their experiences are.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what has gone on in their church, or what has gone on in their, I had one student who was working in a hospice, and so various places like that. And so what we do is we reflect on their experiences, but then also academically, we talk about what the issues are, the very things I'm talking about now, about what to expect,
Mm-hmm.
so that they are prepared for this dynamic. And also, today in the 21st century, we have the challenge of, church being not as well attended, let me put it that way, as it has been in the past. We have the challenge of the nuns and just all of that, which adds another layer to what anyone going into ministry has to deal with. On top of that, we've got all the technology, which is another whole level of something. Because, if you're going to be in ministry, you got to be online some kind of way.
Right.
And so, there was always a lot of pressure. I think my list had 18 different roles that a pastor is likely to play,
Mm-hmm.
all at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And so, but those things have added to it. Those, things about attendance and commitment and technology have added to what a pastor has to deal with. So it's a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else you'd like to share in terms of how you are addressing equity for women in the church, other than what you said already?
Well, I think
thoughts?
the biggest, I've addressed my work at the seminary, at the TRG group later. And believe me, that's a lot. Of course, I have my Bible study remix on Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. On my personal page. But even in that, the way that I approach that is another way of making sure that I talk about women, in this case, biblically, so that we carry that over to what we're doing in church. The two are very directly connected, absolutely. So
yeah. Why do you think it's so, particularly as a biblical scholar, why do you think it's so important, or well, I think you do. Why do you think it's so important that that the stories of women in scripture be amplified? How does that, or how can the amplification of women's stories in the biblical text help with help provide equity for women in the church? What is it about that can make a difference?
Oh, absolutely. Well, so much of our approach to life, if we are, let me just say for a moment, if we are Christians and if we honor the biblical text. So much of how we approach life, so much of how we think about life has some kind of connection to the biblical text. Whether we, whether we read against it, whether we read with it, whether we read with a combination of that.
Mm-hmm.
So with the Bible being so important, being such a foundational piece of the faith, then I think it is really important to lift up women's stories, because women are in the text, but that is not always recognized. That is not always lifted up. We hear stories about David and Abraham and, all those names that become familiar to us, Jacob and all the rest. But who knows about Hannah? Do you really know about Hannah? I know there's a book by the title of Ruth, but do you really know Ruth, and do you really get Ruth and what she represents, or Esther? But also there's so many who are unnamed, and so many who are present in groups. And Dr. Gaffney has done some wonderful work talking about the queens of Israel, and how it was that they had their own stories, and so she tried to fill out what those stories might have been for those women.
And when you say, because everybody listening may not know who Dr. Gaffney is, you're talking about Dr. Will Gaffney, who is the Hebrew Bible scholar at Bright Divinity School. Yes, and she's written several books, but one in particular, it sounds like you're talking about, is her book, Womanist Midrash, where So it's not just, from what I hear you saying, it's not just that you talk about the women in the Bible, but don't you think it is the way that women are talked about? It's the way that women are preached about that can help with a lot of the inequity that we see happening in the church. Can you say a little bit about that, about the particular way or lens through which and how women are preached? Because, I've heard women preached, like I've heard, Esther preached, many times, but there's a way that Esther gets preached sometimes that can be oppressive to women and not lead to equity, right? So there has to be a way in which these women are preached about and taught about that can help as we consider, dismantling the inequity in the church.
Absolutely. Well, for me, I think it's really important to always, what's a good word? Sift, to always have an ethic in mind when we are interpreting scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I sift everything through, Jesus's commandment, love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is an expectation of honoring and lifting up people rather than put down for one reason or another. And let me say this, one place where I start my explanation of that, maybe let me put it that way, of my interpretation is I really interpret chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Genesis really like our Jewish brothers and sisters do, not so much the way many Christians do. Let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, so my ethic in terms of relating to women right now is people in general, but right now specifically related to women. So the first thing we notice is that in chapter 1, the scripture says that what was good is now very good when humanity shows up on the planet. And so for me, that is a really important piece of establishing how awesome humanity is, how awesome women are from the very beginning of the story. So that their mere presence on the planet is something that to be celebrated, just like something to be glad about, something to be excited about, something to say, you know, I am enough. You know, I am enough. Here I am created in the image of God. And the way I sometimes say it is that when I showed up on the planet, what was good was now very good. So I take one and then I take two and I talk about, you know, a lot of people take that story about the woman coming out of the rib and all of that. 1 second and, you know, all kinds of stuff they do with that, right? Make the woman less than.
Yeah.
I try to emphasize is that the writer is not talking about first and second and who's more important and less important and superiority and inferiority. In fact, just the opposite. The writer is talking about the connection between the two, about the fact that you can't have one without the other. And so this writer is using the kinds of words from an ancient time, trying to explain that, you know, humanity is connected, humanity is important, you know, none of this put down stuff. And then when we get to chapter 3 and we get to the story of the Garden of Eden, again, I try to emphasize that that is a story that tells us about brokenness. It is not trying to make woman less. It is not trying to make her secondary. As a matter of fact, when you read closely, you'll notice that the serpent and the ground get cursed, but not humanity in any shape, form, or fashion. And so I try to redirect us, first of all, through these 3 chapters, so that if we get these 3 chapters right, then we can look at the rest of the text in a different light, so that we understand that in those places where there is a put down of a woman or an insult about her womanhood, or maybe when she's not even mentioned or not even, you know, when she's left out of the text, that we have to be conscious of that. She's part of the story from the very beginning, part of what makes it very good. And so then with that lens, I interpret all of, you know, all of the text. And so when I come across texts that where women are named and present in the text, or when they are not there and not are there and not named, I always come back to this particular ethic. Now, what do we know? What do we learn? What do we understand about the awesomeness of woman, and how does it play itself out in this particular text? Or how is it diminished? How is it diminished in a way that it should not be?
Yeah.
And so I'm all over that all the time.
Well, I like that approach. That's a good approach, because there are, you know, as you know, as a biblical scholar, there are several passages where the woman in the text is slaughtered, is dismembered, is murdered at the hands of her father. You know, there's all kind of problematic texts that do not seem to value the personhood and the humanity of woman. And so it sounds like even with those texts, looking through the lens that you use that begins with a stamp of value, then you would even preach those texts different, maybe highlighting the inequity, maybe highlighting the injustice that was meted out to women.
Yes, absolutely. I want to talk just a moment about that last story in Judges, which begins chapters 19 through 21, which begins with the mistreatment of one woman that then becomes the mistreatment of 2 communities of women, 400 and then 200. And you know, those women are raped. I mean, we're talking about the rape of an entire community. We're talking about the overnight rape first of one woman. And
right.
What I like to point out when I talk about and teach and preach and share that text is that the very next book, of course, is First Samuel. And really, First Samuel is about looking for another kind of form of government because things have gotten so bad.
Yeah, because this one ain't working.
Right.
This one ain't working.
And so what I try to point out is that it is an indication that when women are mistreated,
yes,
that is like the bottom of the barrel for society. And that is an indication of how awful things are and how much change is needed.
Yes.
You know, that was really like, other than the Babylonian exile and the loss to Babylon and the exile and loss of the nation, other than that, I would suggest that this is really a major low point in Israel's story where something has to change.
And that's really good. I like that, Dr. Alfie, because what it communicates to us is that these behaviors are not to be emulated, right? The oppression and the mistreatment and the discrimination of and marginalization of women is not, even when it's in the biblical text, isn't something that needs to be emulated. It's something that needs to be dismantled and you know, and done away with for a more equitable world. So, but that's why I think it's important, number one, that women such as yourself, and women like you, and just women, period, you know, get this kind of theological grounding and theological education so that you're armed with the tools to sort of deconstruct these texts, right, that have been traditionally used to keep women in our place, so to speak, you know, because, you know, the Bible, you know, can be and has been used as a tool of subjugation and oppression. So I appreciate your work, and I appreciate the lens through which you view and interpret and preach and teach the biblical text. So thank you for that. So we're winding down now. I do want to say that on the Equity Live page, we've posted your bio. And for those watching, Dr. Wine's bio is underneath. So I would want to ask you, Dr. Wines, what would you say are two of the two things that are on your bio that you are most proud of?
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a lot. Thank you. I guess I would say that the first thing is completing my PhD. That was really important to me. And one of the reasons why that is so important to me is my mom began a PhD.
Oh.
And yeah, she began a PhD. And I remember as a little girl, first of all, I remember how much I enjoyed graduation ceremonies. And I remembered how I loved the music, and I loved the pomp and circumstance, and I loved the colors, and I just fell in love with that whole ceremony and then all that it represented. And of course, when Mother was in school, she would take me with her, and I would spend time in the library. So, you know, I would stay in the library for 2 or 3 hours while she was in class. I have a lot of that going on. And of course, Mom and Dad were teachers, and I come from a family of teachers, and you know, all of that. So I was really glad when I completed my PhD. Sadly, Mom took sick, and so she did not get to complete that. And so I feel really glad that I was able to do that. I'm grateful that when my dad took sick, my brother and his wife took care of my dad, and I didn't have to quit school and go home. So for many reasons, I am very proud of that. And of course, dedicate my work on that to Mom and Dad. The other thing that I am really, really pleased about is how in the last few years, since graduation, of course, But there have been some books that I've written, and of course the one that I'm working on, I've got another one that's going to come up on the Bible and social justice. I'm going to co-author that one. So my writings, as well as the work that I've done online, and of course being back at the seminary. So all of that combined is really what I am really pleased about and really, really proud of, and grateful to have the opportunity to do.
Now, when you say the work you've done online, what are you talking about there?
Okay, so my online journey began with me doing a, a program on Blog Talk Radio that one of our professors, Dr. Zarina Costello, connected me with a friend of hers. And so I began doing a program called Your Jazz for Jesus. That was the first thing that I did. I love jazz, I love gospel jazz. And so I was a bit of an online DJ for about a year.
Okay.
So that was my first thing that I did online. And then once I did that, I said, well, let me try doing some other things. And so still on Blog Talk Radio, I did a Monday morning mastermind for about a year, maybe a year and a half. And that was just, some tidbits for wisdom for living. So I did that. So all of that was audio. Well, Facebook came out with Facebook Live. And it so happened, I love the narrative lectionary because it does Old Testament in the fall and New Testament in the spring. So I've been writing for Working Preacher, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years now. And that particular year, over the summer, they were doing the book of Job. And that's what my favorite book, that's what I did my dissertation on. So that plus the fact of Facebook Live, I started doing Facebook Live Bible study. So that's my Bible study remix. And of course now, the online course, the program. So starting from Your Jazz to Jesus, for what I'm doing now, I've had quite a journey online. And
okay, wonderful.
Yeah. So that's it. That's my online story. We'll see what unfolds as we continue.
Well, in your bio, in which all of these are included, do you see the things that you're doing advancing equity for women in the church? If so, how so?
Oh my goodness. Well, for sure, the things that I do advance equity for women in the church. And I think, well, already, let me put it this way. Already my work does, but I believe that when this book comes out, I believe it's going to take my work for equity for women in the church to a whole new level. And that will, open a whole lot of doors so that people will really, I think sometimes people don't really the grasp, in the same way that we've talked about, Me Too has become a big thing in terms of women when it has really come out over the last, couple of years about how women were treated in the workplace and different situations. And I think that this book will help do some of the same thing for clergy women and women in the church. And so I certainly am hopeful that, that women will see themselves, will be able to share their own stories, and that it will open up some more avenue for dialogue and more avenue for actually making the changes that need to be made. So
wonderful. So as we get ready to close, I would like for you to share any words of hope or encouragement for women in ministry, clergy women, and anyone who's listening or who's watching this live stream who is concerned about equity for women in the church. Words of hope and encouragement.
Oh, wow. Well, my hope and encouragement is that, first of all, if for the women, if you've got the desire, go for it. Don't let anybody or anything or any situation deter you And let me remind you that life happens on the way.
Yeah.
And don't let that deter you. For example, while I was in seminary, my dad passed, my son-in-law passed.
Mm.
So you know, life was happening. Some stuff
Yeah.
happening, and I could have perhaps stopped at any one of those places,
Mhm.
but of course decided to continue. You know, don't let the lack of, oh, here's another one. Don't let the lack of money stop you.
Girl, yes.
Because let me tell you, when you move forward, God will make a way. Let me tell you this part of my seminary story. And that is, there was a semester when I had decided I wasn't going to go that semester, that, you know, the money had not lined up like I thought it would. So I was going to lay out and come back in another semester or two. Well, anyway, thank goodness, my beloved Dr. Tony Craven had her assistant leave me a message that I never will forget. It said, Alfie Wines, where are you? Why aren't you in class today? And so, of course, I showed up at, you know, on campus the next day. There are 4 people along the way that encouraged me. First, Robbie Martinsfield, who was a classmate, who said, oh, Alfie, don't quit. At least take one class. Because when you take one, you know, when people don't take any, they don't come back very often. So don't do that. Take at least one. All right. So then I went and I ran into Dr. Sprinkle, who is the one, of course, who invited me, my professor, who invited me to come to Bright and lead the theological reflection group, and he was on my panel too. But at any rate, I never will forget this. I literally cried on his shoulder, right? And so he encouraged me, and he said, you know, don't quit. I said, okay, all right, I'll go. All right. So by the time I got to Dr. Craven, who was my, my counselor, my major professor, I had decided, okay, I'm in school. I guess I'll take at least 3. And lo and behold, I think I ended up with 4 classes. All right, so they got me in school. Now, still, I have no clue. Let me tell you, I still had no clue where the money was coming from. But I showed up in class. I went to chapel. They found out I was a pianist. And so one classmate invited me to come and play at her church. Dr. Sprinkle invited me to come and play at his church. The church where I used to be a member was looking for a coordinator of ministries. I got that job, and my piano teacher, who was teaching me jazz piano, was looking for somebody to help him. And so I helped him teach piano. I put those 4 little part-time jobs together, and lo and behold, I was able to stay in school. And of course, the rest is history. And so I want people to know, don't let money be an issue. That when you step out on faith,
That's it.
that it will make all the difference in the world.
Well, thank you. That's a great way to end. That's a great way to end our time together. Dr. Alfie, thank you so much for carving out this particular day and time to talk with us on Equity Live. Looking forward to continuing to work with you and continuing and watching you as you make a difference in the world through your teaching and through your preaching and through your ministry. So thank you so much for joining us on Equity Live today.
Thank you for having me. Blessings to you, Dr. Irie.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.